And then I'm going to record this channel. Awesome. All right, I think we're ready to go, Becca.
Cool. Sorry, I was on mute because my keyboard is really loud. I don't know if y'all run into that problem, but anyways, get weird about it. So thanks again for having me. I really appreciate the time and the willingness for y'all to go on this training journey with me. We're going to be talking about storytelling in the context of policy advocacy today. So I have a couple slides that we're going to go over the next, I want to say until like about 10:15, and then we'll spend the rest of the time like doing some storytelling prompts. So just to start off, I'm sure you all have like collective agreements with each other, but I just wanted to share that, like, this is a safe space. When we're talking about storytelling and story sharing, it can often be emotional, both in like, in a variety of ways. And I just wanted to make sure that we acknowledge that that's a potential, and that we respect each other, and that, if we're working on draft stories today, we keep an open mind and we respect each other's experience. So just wanted to start off with that. And then, like I said, I'm going to go over some policymaking processes and how storytelling can be a tool that we use in those. Then we're going to do some story writing practice, and then talk about a couple of food system campaigns that are in process. So I like to use storytelling as one tool as part of policy advocacy, and policy advocates are really what makes policy advocacy and policy change happen. So I just always like to start off trainings reminding folks that we actually can and do create change by being policy advocates. We've seen this with the creation of a local food policy council program, which Caitlin just mentioned, the HIP program, many farmland and soils programs with NOFA, etc. Policy advocates also play a critical role in moving legislation forward and holding legislators accountable. So making sure that they know about issues important in their districts and to their constituents. And finally, last but not least by any means, you are the expert of your story and your lived experience. No one else has that, and that's really powerful, and legislators need to hear that. So when we're talking about law, this is the basic process of passing a bill in Massachusetts. So this is a little bit fuzzy, I apologize, but this is from a broader bill report that we have from a couple years ago. So when we're talking about policy advocacy, the way that I like to remind folks to think about it is policy is basically like a set of rules that says that we live in a society that governs itself in this way or that way. So if you have an idea for a bill, there's actually a step before this chart. You should actually like talk to your legislator and see like how say an issue in the food system is affecting you and how it's currently regulated and legislated around. So once you've come up with that idea to improve something that is affecting you, a bill is proposed by a senator or representative. And then we often, if we're running an advocacy campaign, ask other members of the legislator's chamber to sign on and support. It's called co-sponsors when they list their name on a bill or like a budget amendment. Once a bill has been introduced into the legislature, it is assigned to a committee. Generally, that's just based on topic area. That committee then schedules hearings. We're starting to see those get scheduled right now, but those will be anytime in the next 2 years. And those are always public. So those hearings provide an opportunity for input. So you can testify on a bill, you can testify for it, against it, with, suggested ways to improve a bill, etc. And then the committee, once they've heard that public testimony, they gather that and then decide to move the bill. If they reject the bill, they can send it to study, which is often a way of, killing a bill. They can move it to another committee that would also be relevant to the bill. For example, with the HIP bill, we've often seen it assigned to the Committee on Children, Families, and Persons with Disabilities, which deals with a lot of welfare issues. And then it gets assigned to healthcare financing. And then it gets assigned to the Ways and Means Committee, which is the Budget Committee. That's the way it's gone in previous sessions. And then you'll see the second committee go through the same process. They review the bill, they debate it, they propose changes, and then if they approve the bill, it will move on to the full chamber. So the House and the Senate will then vote to approve or reject it. It starts generally in one chamber, and then if it's approved, it gets sent to the other chamber for consideration and approval. And then finally, once you've made it through the entire process, the governor will sign or veto the bill. The bill can be like approved in full, or it can be sent back to the legislature with suggested edits for how the governor would actually like to see it edited and then implemented. And so once all of that has happened, you'll have like a signing ceremony. The governor will sign it in a big fancy pen, and then the bill is actually law. So this sounds like a little bit of a journey, but it's often, this is kind of an idealized version of what happens. There are often really complex bills that go through many additional steps. There are some urgent bills like emergency measures. We saw with the fall of Roe v. Wade last year, a lot of bills around abortion as healthcare were passed pretty quickly after that. Some bills passed in what's called informal session last year that usually you only see pass in what's called formal session. So just to say, there are many ways to advocate during this process. And this is, again, like a broad overview. That's not always the way that things go in real life. Okay, so when we're talking about bills being introduced, that's always in a 2-year timeline for the legislature. In Massachusetts, each session is 2 years long. So when we are talking about bills being introduced, that's always in roughly the first 3 weeks of January. During the pandemic, that deadline was extended. It has now been shifted back to roughly 3 or 4 weeks. You can always introduce bills late. They'll just have like a special, like this was filed late note attached to them. But that's a way to, get a conversation started about a relevant issue. Like we saw some bills filed around like food is medicine that were late filed that did result in getting, some advocacy around the 1115 waiver. Those helped that conversation get going and that conversation continue. Again, then we see the bills assigned to a relevant committee. That's happening now. Those committees are starting to have hearings. At the same time, we also have the annual budget process each spring of a given session. You'll have committee hearings run again from like now until the deadline to move, which is roughly at the end of the first year of a session. So that'll be around like December of 2023 or January 2024. And then you'll have what's called formal session end on June 30th of the second year of the session. It basically means that like you have bills that pass in what's called informal session after this. Generally, they're very non-controversial. They deal with like local issues, but sometimes we can't have larger packages like the economic development bill pass. And again, many times things don't happen by the books, and that can be used to our advantage. There are bills that pass that are must-pass bills, like the budget. There are bills that sometimes get attached as outside sections to larger packages. There are many different slightly wonky ways to use all of these processes to our advantage. And I'm not going to go into all of them right now, but just to know that like these aren't necessarily like strict deadlines. There are many ways to like advocate and make sure that things happen that we want. Okay. So the budget, I just said like, this is technically in the spring, but really it's a little bit longer than that. Each one of these points has an opportunity for advocacy. So in generally the fall, you'll have departments like DPH work with their agency, which DPH is under the Health and Human Services Secretariat. So they'll work on submitting their budget requests to the governor for their staffing and their programs. Usually in early January, the governor will propose their budget. That has an asterisk because this year Maura Healey is new. So she actually had an extended deadline. She released her budget on March 1st, which means that this process is a little bit compressed this year. It's only in that first year. So next year we'll see her budget in early January. And then once that's been released, you have the Joint Committee on Ways and Means. It's a fancy way for saying Money Committee. They hold public hearings where the administration testifies. These are generally done by topic issue. They've been held all over the state, so there's opportunity for folks to come and watch the administration and the, commissioners of various agencies come and speak. There's generally one public hearing where like the public in general gets to testify. We haven't really worked on getting folks to turn out for that because we feel like we have relationships that we can leverage with legislators, but it is an option. You can testify on whatever you want. There are often a lot of different campaigns that will have folks show up to that hearing. I believe it was a couple weeks ago, and it's usually like at the State House, and now with the pandemic, there is a hybrid option. And then in April, you'll see the House Ways and Means Committee, they release their budget proposal to the full House. Members of the House get the opportunity to review the budget for a couple of days. Then they get the opportunity to offer amendments, which are basically like edits. They say, I want to cross out this amount of money and insert this amount of money instead. This week, they're debating the bill and all those amendments. There are about 1,500 amendments this year. I think it's the highest that it's ever been. Those range really broadly from like implementing ballot questions that passed last year to funding local projects in various districts, and then the full body votes each up or down. Because there are so many, you usually get several amendments consolidated into what are called consolidated amendments. Usually it's like A through F. They're again by topic area. So a lot of the ones relating to the food system will be classified under energy and environmental affairs, social services for things like HIP and proposed changes to SNAP. And then local and economic development as well for like local earmarks. And then the House at the end of this week, they'll pass a final amended budget. I would say that, before April is the time to speak with your representatives about getting an earmark introduced if you want something for like a local project or if you want them to support a specific campaign in the legislature. We are generally on a little bit of a crunch this year because of that compressed timeline I mentioned, but there is an opportunity to make sure that, they introduce something that is important to you in their district, or if you want them to sign on and co-sponsor Food Policy Council amendment, that is definitely something that you can ask them to do. It's just important to remember that there are deadlines for this specific process to introduce amendments and to get co-sponsors on them. And then the Senate will do the same thing, but next month, the Senate Committee on Ways and Means, they hold hearings, they release their budget. They will then, have senators review the proposal, they offer amendments and debate the whole bill, and then the full body will vote each up or down. That generally goes through the same process. They have like a couple days to review it and offer amendments. And then there'll be a week for folks to co-sponsor. And then the following week, which is usually like at the end of May, sometimes June, depending on the year, folks will then debate and vote the whole budget up or down. And then usually there are many differences between the House and Senate budget. So you have a conference committee formed to reconcile those differences. The conference committee is usually 6 members. It's the chair of House Ways and Means, vice chair of House Ways and Means, again, chair and vice chair of Senate Ways and Means, and then the ranking minority from both the House and Senate, which is a fancy way of saying the Republican Party because they're the smaller party in the legislature. And so they form a body, they reconcile the differences, they can get input from folks. So there's definitely an opportunity to advocate here. But once it's been released to both chambers, it can't be amended. You either vote it yes or vote it no. And then technically by June 30th, there's another asterisk here because this has been late in many recent years. The governor is supposed to sign veto or veto part of the budget and suggest changes for the legislature to consider. So that's, again, why there's an asterisk there. Sometimes you'll see them pass what's called a 1/12 budget, which just funds the state government for like another month, so they can continue debating if the budget's going to be late. And so again, each of these points has an opportunity for advocacy. I would say that, reach out to state representatives in March, reach out to senators now through early May. Each of these points is a very key point for advocacy, especially making sure that they know, what's important in their districts. All right, and I just used a lot of wonky language, so I just wanted to explain a little bit further, like what I mean by a budget amendment. So if you have a specific request for, your legislator, if it's like, again, I'm going to use the Food Policy Council program because I'm talking to a Food Policy Council and I like that we got you all money in the grant program. So I'm really happy that that happened. But generally how it works is if you have something that you want to be funded in the state budget, talk to a legislator before the Ways and Means Committee budget is released. Generally speaking, each legislator, will have an opportunity to have a one-on-one conversation with the chair of the Ways and Means Committee in their chamber before that proposal is released, to be like, here are my priorities, here are things that I'm going to be asking for my district, and here are the things that I care about statewide. And if you want to have a budget amendment or an earmark that's actually funded, it's important to get that on a list. So then once you've had that conversation and they support it, this is obviously like a very idealized process, right? A legislator will introduce your request. It'll get assigned a number, so amendment like 100. Then depending on the issue, you'll get other legislators to co-sponsor and then repeat it in the other chamber. What we call earmarks are things that are for specific projects, programs, municipal programs, nonprofit organizations, local businesses, etc. Generally speaking, only legislators that cover like that area. So like if your city is split into like 3 districts like mine is, generally the legislators from that entire city will co-sponsor something to benefit Groundwork Somerville, for example. But if we're talking about a statewide program, like the Food Policy Council grant program, every single legislator should be asked to co-sponsor these, because every single community could have a local food policy council, right? And like those do really important work. I say every legislator, but I also included this note that generally leadership does not introduce or co-sponsor amendments. And that means, again, the folks that are in charge of the budget, so the House Ways and Means and Senate Ways and Means chair, and the Speaker of the House and Senate President. So it's not like anything, against advocacy. They just generally don't, because they're trying to focus on, making sure that all of the amendments get through the process and like work to figure out what the final amount of the budget is going to be. So I am sure that you all already know this, but I just like to put names to faces when we're doing advocacy work. So when we're talking specifically about Hampshire County legislators, these are the folks that we're talking about. I'm sure Caitlin has emailed all of them. I don't mean to do a one-on-one when you already know all of this, but when we're talking about like advocacy and making sure that the legislators know our stories, these are the folks that I believe that you're going to be speaking to on the 31st of May. Is that right, Caitlin?
Yeah, we also have Rep Saunders, which I can't even remember what that person's district is, but Emily and I kind of strategized around who to talk to. Maybe Emily remembers. Emily here? Yeah, she's here.
I haven't heard back from him yet, but I think he has like Shutesbury, Leverett, like that area. And I think it's a little bit of
Pelham.
I don't think it just has Hampshire County. I think it's like a little, I don't know, it's weird.
Okay.
It's like kind of out there.
All right, so he's less of a priority for us, maybe, anyway. Yeah, and we actually didn't have Gobi or Olivera.
And Jake also isn't in Hampshire County, I don't think.
When I looked at the map yesterday, they had small parts of Hampshire County. So again, apologies if that's wrong, but like they don't need to be a priority if it's like not really, the main part of the county, if they have like multiple pieces of county. That's understandable.
It's kind of like you just sort of have to just put your, figure out where you're gonna get the most bang for your buck, I think. So it's not, I'd say it's like more of an art than a science, maybe, what we consider our Hampshire County legislators. But yeah, and I was curious, Becca, on your last slide, are any of these legislators in those roles that you mentioned?
Sadly, no. The House Ways and Means chair is from Boston, Speaker of the House from Quincy, the Senate Ways and Means chair is from New Bedford area, and the Senate president is from Framingham. These folks have leadership roles. They're just like not, like Senator Comerford is on the Ways and Means Committee, I believe. And I believe so is Ann Goby, but they're not like the chairs, which it is what it is. I think that even though that they are elected to represent a specific district, if they're in leadership, they are supposed to care about statewide issues, right? And like, if they're supposed to care about statewide issues, then they need to hear from folks statewide about how the issues are affecting them. So that's kind of our job to make sure that they know that, there are various issues across the state. They don't necessarily affect Boston versus like Hampshire County the same, but they can be faced with a common solution.
And with earmarks, are those typically only reps that introduce earmarks, or no, senators
No.
too?
Senators too. Sometimes you'll like hear about leadership telling reps or senators that they have a specific like pot of money that they can allocate in a given way for their district. Sometimes you'll see folks introduce things like right before the deadline that I feel like were probably late requests from a local project. You'll see senators introduce earmarks as well. Sometimes I think it depends on the legislator what strategy you want to go with, but sometimes they'll want to just file something in the House, and then it gets included in the House version, and then the senator can focus on other needs in the district that like both the rep and senator cover, or you can do it in both chambers and see, which one gets a higher amount and then go with that amount in like your final advocacy to the conference committee. So I would say that they both to introduce earmarks, but of course House reps have much smaller districts. Generally speaking, they only represent like 40,000 people, whereas senators, I think it's 150,000. Don't quote me on that. I forget the exact number. It's more than 100,000. So they'll have more things to introduce, generally speaking. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
All right, so these are our legislators, with maybe a few exceptions that are mostly based in other counties. So I like to just remind myself of like who the legislators are specifically before we talk about relationship building, because I like to have a face in mind. If that helps you, then I mean, maybe Google them and remind yourself who your legislator is. Something I do in advocacy trainings is to remind folks that legislators are people. And so I'll have folks often, Google their legislator and then figure out what they did before they were elected. I like doing this just because it reminds folks, and feel free to do this now while I'm speaking, that, folks had a career before. They're not experts in every single thing, and legislators need to hear from their constituents to both hear about how an issue is affecting them and to actually learn from their constituents. So that's why I always say, remember, they're people. They don't know everything. Their staff are really great, but they're always learning. So when we're talking about relationship building, I see storytelling and sharing as one part of relationship building. So I'm trying to like start out with like the budget process and then narrow us down to storytelling. But I think there are also a couple important pieces to relationship building that are beyond storytelling. So I just wanted to go over them briefly. I think that it is often hard to feel like we can carve out the time to do something that, isn't as productive as crossing off something on our like to-do list, or it might not appear that way at first. But I do think that building relationships with legislators, even when we don't have an immediate ask, just to like say thank you or like to check in or invite them out to an event that you're doing, is really important, because that can help build your relationship to make sure that you can call upon that legislator at like a moment's notice. And that relationship building also includes staff. Staff often field constituent services requests. They often help write legislation. They do a lot of the background work, and I wouldn't be discouraged if you get staff when you're calling the State House for a campaign, for example, because they are the ones that like will ultimately like take down your name, take down your number, take down your position on an issue, and they help move the issues forward. And even if, you know, you're in touch with that staff member, you're in touch with that legislator, you know that they're like supportive of food system issues, they still need to hear from you. It helps them to hear stories from their district, or to hear that, you know, 10 members of the local food policy council want them to vote a certain way on a bill, because it helps justify their position to other legislators, to their colleagues, and it helps turn them into advocates on your behalf. And I would just say that, you know, when we're talking about bills, we often start out the session asking folks to co-sponsor bills, but co-sponsoring is just one step. It's not the final thing that we should be asking for. We, again, want to turn folks into advocates on our behalf. So we want to ask them, once they've co-sponsored something, if they can make it top of their list to help prioritize, either to pass in the budget or to pass the session as a bill standalone. And finally, I know advocacy can often be a multi-year process, and that can be frustrating, especially for folks who are impatient like myself. But it's important to remember to not get discouraged if something doesn't pass in, you know, a given year or a given budget. That is just another opportunity for us to continue building that relationship, continue advocating. All right. So when we're talking about relationship building, I'm generally talking about, you know, checking in with folks via email, via phone, seeing them at in-person events. But one thing that I know y'all are talking about is doing visits with legislators in the State House. I'm gonna try and like do this, but can y'all like raise your hand if you've been to the State House, just to like, for me to get a sense? Cool. Or you can like use the like thumbs up if you're not on camera. Awesome. So if you've been to the State House, you know what it's like, but if you haven't, I think that, you know, just generally like being aware that like, you know, you'll walk into the building through various entrance, you'll go through security, and then it's a little bit wonky sometimes depending on what floor your state legislators' offices are on. You know, the building is like split into half depending on the lower floor that you're on. It can get a little bit strange to find those offices, but it's generally a really friendly space. If you get lost, you can always like knock on someone's door and ask the person who's at the reception desk like where to go. I think it's often a very intimidating space, if I'm being honest, but it is the people's house, and it is the space where you elect, like the people that you've elected go to do business on your behalf. So I think that remembering, you know, the State House is a public building, and it is a space where we should remember to build relationships in person now that, you know, with masking, et cetera, like things are a little bit safer than they were a couple of years ago. And I would just say that when you're going to do visits with legislators, you'll head to their office, and then we'll have an idealized version of that on the next slide. So, I mean, this is again, like very much an idealized version, but this is what conversations with legislators I've had look like. When we go in to do lobby days for HIP or for Agriculture Day at the State House, we have these conversations where we either like just drop in. That's definitely something that you can do. You don't necessarily have to have a meeting. You can just go to someone's office and ask if they're there or if their staff are there. But this is generally for like a scheduled meeting. So you'll generally do like introductions, who's in the room, why they're there. You'll introduce the topic you're there to speak with them about. Generally, I would just give like a brief overview, and then we'll talk about sharing our stories in a minute, and then the facts that you have about the issue to persuade them. Generally speaking, I would, you know, make sure that legislators have time to ask any questions, ask things about your story, ask if there are specific impacts in their district that you can share. If you know the answers to that, that's totally great. But if you don't, I always tell folks not to feel pressure to make up an answer. just tell them that you'll follow up, and that's a really easy way to make sure that you get their business card, which, you know, you want to follow up anyways, but making sure that you follow up with answers to those questions is another way to continue that relationship. And then once you've done all of that, you can ask for their support. If they say yes, that's great. You can thank them. Or if you know that they're already supportive, then you kind of know where they stand. If they are a little bit unsure, you can ask them like what questions they have that you can answer. If there's anything else that, you know, you could share with data that you have at your disposal that could help answer that question and solidify their position on the issue. And then, of course, thank them and their staff for their time and their willingness to meet. And so I just want to go back. When we're talking about like conversations with the legislator, I didn't really highlight this, but storytelling and sharing is a really important piece of this. I think that, you know, we can often get caught up in like just sharing like facts and hard numbers, but storytelling is in particularly important because it helps to illustrate what a program is actually doing in a district. For example, if we're talking about like a statewide program, or just illustrate like what folks are struggling with, what folks are really proud of in the district. And they do help, again, play an important role in the legislative process by giving folks evidence and testimony that they can use to convince their colleagues of the importance of, you know, a certain position on an issue. And so these are just general like guidelines for like what I think is helpful for sharing a story. Like, I think that it's, you know, ultimately your story is your story, but I would just generally make it easy to understand, make it heartfelt and true. Don't exaggerate it and make it purposeful, excuse me. And then of course, end with like what you want your listener to do. If you're talking to a state legislator, then we're talking about like state bills. If we're talking to someone at the city level or the municipal level, then we want to ask them about like municipal ordinances. I would just make sure that like, you know, those are in the right place, and make sure to know your audience. So that's why I always tell folks to Google your legislators, figure out what they did beforehand, so you know that like you can play to those strengths. So again, just to be clear, like I wanted to just kind of repeat this a couple of times because I do think storytelling is really important, and it can take a little bit of time, but it is really one of those most important pieces that we do in advocacy. So stories, again, they have emotional impact. They help remind politicians that programs actually do have real life impact. Often, you know, when you're dealing with a job in the state house, you're dealing with a lot of like email and reviewing bills on paper or on your computer, and actually like seeing someone in real life really helps remind folks that what they do in the building has a real life impact. And again, it helps craft their position on a bill. So I like to remind folks when we're talking about storytelling that every single person has a food system story to tell, because the food system affects all of us, you know, in ways both good and bad. We know that it's a very imperfect system. We know that it's not working for everyone. And there are ways that legislators can help us make it better. Again, turning legislators into advocates on our behalf in the building is one of the main goals that I have with storytelling and sharing with folks. You know, once someone has heard your story, they will probably use that as evidence, not as evidence, but like as their like internal justification for a position on bill. I think that, you know, it's a little bit harder to see, but the like conversations that legislators have with one another is really impacted by the amount of like stories that they hear from their constituents, what those stories entail, and what they're also hearing from statewide advocates. And again, we can align stories with campaign messages and calls to action, but I also think that if, you know, we're still developing policy platforms, et cetera, stories in general help us align the policy goals across issues and help us win. And so these are just, again, a couple like guidelines that I wanted to share. The story you choose to share, it does make an impact. I would just generally say share something that only you can, so only something that's part of your story. Who you are and your story matters. Your lived experience is what we're calling it these days. It does really matter. You know, not everyone experiences the food system in the same way, and folks who have lived experience with, you know, hunger, food insecurity, you know, dealing with the school meals process, those stories are, not to say like any story matters more than another, each story matters, but like those stories are particularly important because it really matters to hear how programs are working, how we can better solve these issues that really just shouldn't be something that we're dealing with in 2023. And personal stories are much more resonant than like, I heard this through the grapevine, but like if there's someone that is in our policy circle that we're bringing their story to the State House, then I would say treat that story with a lot of respect and make sure that, you know, a legislator or someone who's listening to that story, make sure that they know how to follow up with that person. And so we're going to do a couple prompts in a few minutes, but I just want to say, you know, these are a couple things to think about before we get to the prompt area of the session. So again, what is your unique story? What are the emotional highs and lows? What are the moments of clarity? Is there something someone said to you that's really stuck with you? And what do you share about yourself to explain when you're really having a deep conversation with someone? Those are just a couple like prompts to get the brain juices flowing. You don't have to necessarily like take that into the storytelling prompts. I will share these slides with you after. So don't feel like you need to take notes on all these questions. I don't mean to like create more work for you, but those are just some ideas to get it going for you. And again, when we're trying to create stories or, you know, retell stories that we've experienced in our life, creating a compelling story really matters. It's not just like I went on a grocery trip and like, you know, bought some oranges. Emotion and authenticity, excuse me, matter. You know, it's really important to, if you're actually someone who has lived experience with an issue, that the story comes from you. I talk about this often in the campaigns that I help coordinate with the collaborative. We usually bring a hip farmer and a hip consumer into our meetings with legislators because they can hear like the statewide picture from me, that's fine, but like it's much more important for them to hear from farmers who are growing and actually like participating in the program, and as well as consumers who are benefiting from the program, about how it's working for them, about what impact it's made in their life and, you know, their families' lives or their businesses. That's kind of like a key part of my ethos, and I think it really does help legislators to hear from folks who are directly impacted. And again, if you have pictures of things that you can share with your story, if you want to like print them out or email them to your legislator, that also helps. But also I would say that like just going in person and like meeting, or if you want to meet with them on Zoom, that is also really impactful. All right, and so again, we're going to get to a prompt in a minute, but I just wanted to give like some quick guidelines, starting with the basics of like what things are like for you on a day-to-day basis is probably a good way to start. So, you know, the classics of if you've ever taken like a writing course, you start with who, what, when, where, why, and how. And then you can describe a moment that caused your circumstances to change. So for example, the introduction of a new food program or lack thereof. And then the ending, I would always, if we're talking about advocacy stories, and with a call to action for the person you're telling the story to. Again, like when we're talking about conversations with legislators, we will also have that ask, probably reiterated at a later point. But if you're telling your story, I want you to make sure that you're asking someone to do something that helps with the story in a given way. And again, I did say this at the beginning, but sometimes storytelling can be pretty emotional, and I just want to recognize that and acknowledge it. If you're scared to tell your story, that is totally fair. And I would say that, be honest about that. Tell the listener why you're nervous or feeling scared. Maybe what the consequences are of telling your story have been, and ask for their empathy. That's, listeners and legislators are people again, and they'll understand. Stories do not necessarily have to be all positive to be effective. I don't think that 100% happy stories are really realistic, especially when we've been through a pandemic and we're heading into a recession, apparently according to The Economist. I'm not an economist. But I do think it is okay to share that there are tensions in your life, why it's hard to be you specifically. No one is expecting stories to be 100% happy all the time. All right. And so I'm going to stop there because I feel like there are a lot of questions in the chat that I haven't been able to look at, but I just wanted to make space while we have some to see if you all had any questions about the legislative process or storytelling, excuse me. And I love Caitlin sharing about Minnie Dom and Joe Comerford in the chat, which is, yeah, they are great allies. Kristen, I saw your hand.
Yeah, thank you so much, Becca. Really, really helpful, interesting. I learned a lot. I feel like I still have a lot to learn. Glad you're going to share the slides, because I think I'll enjoy looking back at them. One of the things that you said just now was about having a clear ask or connecting your story directly to sort of what exactly you're advocating for. And I was wondering how, if you could talk a little bit about a process for helping us to do that, because I think that we're, and not necessarily for our trip to the State House, but just sort of more broadly, thinking about people are going to be telling stories that are personal and related to whatever experiences they have. And then there are a set of bills that are being considered and, moving through the process. How do we kind of think about matching stories to specific advocacy or using stories to potentially develop new bills or new ideas that we want to bring to legislators? What is that process? How would you kind of recommend we blend those two pieces?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that it depends on the story, so I'm not going to give you a concrete answer, but I think that if you know about the bills, which we're going to talk about a little bit later, oftentimes it can be a little bit easier to see solutions. But if there are things that folks are running into that are not necessarily addressed by any of the food system bills introduced, then we can start to brainstorm with our allies how that could be better addressed. In other advocacy trainings I've done, I have used the example of you're a hip farmer and all of a sudden the program runs out of money. It's 2019. How do you advocate for this? And I think that has a really obvious answer, you go to the State House and ask for more money, but there are oftentimes multiple solutions for things that our folks are running into. If we're talking about someone living in I feel like I've heard the phrase food desert, food swamp, and food apartheid all used recently. So whatever one of those resonates most deeply with you, if that's something that you're experiencing, then the Mass Food Trust program exists. There are also mobile markets that are being funded to increase access to local food. There are also zoning regulations at the local level that you can pass to encourage larger grocery stores to come in and set up shop in a neighborhood. So again, that's just an example of a one story, multiple solutions. So I don't necessarily think that it's something we can talk about in the abstract, but I think it's something that like once we have a couple stories, we can talk about potential solutions. And I think that's something that we're probably going to do in a second session. Does that help, Kristen?
Yeah, it does. Thank you. It makes me think that, yeah, we need to spend some, and maybe the policy circle has been doing this, but spending some time really looking at what the bills are that are currently kind of being talked about and thinking about the stories that we have that might support them. And to know that like there may be stories that come out that are not directly connected to any solution that's currently being talked about. And that's also totally good. And, you know, will help us to potentially be creative in thinking about new legislation.
And I would just say that like from the collaborative's perspective, we're always here to help talk through like legislation and like ideas if folks have them for potential new pieces of legislation or bills.
Cool.
So that's something I'm always trying to keep an eye out for, but lately have been slacking on a little bit because of other things going on. And I see Kia's question in the chat. I think that, you know, when we're talking about like story length, I do think it should be like there's a fine balance, right? Where we want detail, but like not like overly detailed. So I would say between like 2 to 5 minutes to start as like a goal should be like a story length. And that comes with practice and making sure that we're talking. I've grown up in Eastern Massachusetts, so I know I talk really quickly and I apologize for that. But you know, it is what it is. If you talk fast in general, that's just something to recognize. And I think I saw Rosalind's hand earlier. Did you have a question?
Looks like she's frozen.
Yeah.
Oh, there she is. Roz, try turning your video back off.
All right, maybe we'll come back to her in a minute if anyone else has any questions. Kia.
So we've been talking a lot about supporting stuff that's already in the pipeline. And I think I heard you mention something that if we wanted to bring something brand new, that's doable. If we can keep it between 2 and 3 minutes, for example, something that I have in the back of my mind that I've always wanted to bring up to somebody in power, but just never had the guts to do it. But I think this might be the place to do it. So I don't know. I mean, so do you think, I mean, for this particular trip, should we keep it to what's already like advocate for stuff that's already out there, or can we introduce a new idea?
I think that's ultimately a strategy question for the Food Policy Council. So I don't want to like overreach here. But I think you can do a combination of like both sharing that there are bills introduced that you'd like to see passed and you'd like to see folks support. But if there are, you know, new issues, then that's something that you can work with your legislator, on introducing as like a late filed bill to start that conversation. I think it depends on like what the issue is. So if it fits into the prompts that we're going to go into in a couple minutes, then like feel free to write it down there.
Okay.
But it's kind of hard for me to like talk about in the abstract.
Right, I got you. Okay, thank you.
I would also say, Kia, like, I really appreciate Becca's offer of like thinking through like a legislative approach to an issue. And I think like that's a great type of support to take advantage of before we even get to the point of talking to a legislator about a new idea, right? Like, let's see how much we can like refine this into an area of doability before we even like approach a legislator with it. So I would encourage you to talk to Becca if you have an idea and see if she can recommend an approach.
And I'll put my email in the chat.
Okay, I will do that. Thank you.
Right. I see Robbie's hand.
Okay, so, Lindsay and I have been talking about, this transportation, bill that she's been working on, and, so we're going to be there and mostly talking to senators. No, but we'll still be talking to, reps too.
Yeah,
Um,
because of the timeline, it says that we're not like, it's not gonna be a great time to be like influencing a whole lot this budget season. So we're just talking, we're just building relationships with everybody. So I would say it's like kind of 50-50 reps and senators.
Okay, because it definitely, the story that I'm thinking of definitely has an impact on transportation and food access. And I know, I don't know the name of the bill or the number of the bill, but she talked to my daughter, and we have talked with her, and I know that she filed it, and it's in the works. So I'm really interested in seeing it, in supporting it. So yeah.
That's awesome. Yeah. Something I didn't really talk about, but I think you all probably like know in general, is that food touches so many other issues, and food is like a way to talk about a lot of different issues, including transportation, housing, economic development, climate change, and climate justice, and environmental justice more broadly. And I think that making those connections for legislators to just illustrate them in like a very obvious way, that like if there's, if my RTA, my regional transit authority, is not funded to have good service, that impacts my ability to go to the grocery store, that impacts my ability to be connected with my community. That's really important for them to hear, which I'm sure you already know, but like I just wanted to reiterate, excuse me, for the recording. So thank you, Robbie. All right, and I see Pat, who hasn't spoken yet. So Kristen, I'll get to you in a minute, sorry.
Thank you. I'm just wondering, are there current bills right now about food access or fund that you could tell us, because that would help me kind of figure out a line to get there.
Yeah, there are a lot of bills that I'm going to talk about. I was going to talk about them after the story prompts, which, we can change if that would be more helpful for y'all. But I think that our idea was to have folks talk about their own stories first and then kind of connect them to bills second.
Okay.
So sorry to like keep teasing them, but yes, they're coming, I promise. Kristen?
Yeah, my question is more like logistics, back to like the timeline that you showed in the beginning. And if you talked about this while I had to step away, just let me know and I can look at the slides. But I wanted to just understand a little more about like the fiscal year versus the calendar year, and like, does this whole process happen every year? Like I heard you mention 2-year, there's like a 2-year time period. Yeah, if you could just talk a little more about that.
Yeah, it is confusing, so sorry about that. The fiscal year for the state of Massachusetts runs July 1st to June 30th. So like it's named for the year that the fiscal year will end in. So fiscal year 2024, which is the budget that we're currently advocating for, runs from July 1st, 2023, assuming, it's not late, and then runs until June 30th, 2024. That's just the state of Massachusetts has an annual operating budget. Other states have very different processes, but that's how ours works. And then legislators are elected to serve for a 2-year session. So that session, we're currently in the first year of a session. So the 2023 to 2024 session will have both 2 annual budget processes, and then bills operate on a different timeline within that session process. So they generally speaking, have to be reported out at the end of the first year of a session. What's meant by that is like they have to be like the committee that they're assigned to, the first one that they're assigned to has to take action on that bill. And they need to like report out favorably for it to still be in play, basically. And then other things will happen in the second year of a session to see like if it gets assigned to a second committee, if it gets passed on to the full chamber, or if it gets attached to like a different piece of legislation, which we saw with some food system stuff last year's economic development bill. They didn't make it through the entire process, but they did get attached in the Senate. So that's another way to like advocate for things to keep moving forward. Does that help?
Yeah, that helps. I think I have to do more reading on my own, but yeah,
Yeah.
thank you.
And I'll share the slides. So like, feel free to like ask me questions.
Thanks.
Worst thing to do when sharing a story with legislators. I don't know. I mean, I think that like generally, like anyone, folks who are in elected office don't really respond well to being shamed. For like, you know, if they've taken a position that like we as food system advocates would like them to change, shaming them for that is like not really the way that I would go about it, at least to start out. A lot of legislators, when we first started advocating for HIP, had a lot of preconceptions about folks who receive SNAP. And so we had to do a lot of education about like why those perceptions were wrong. And here's what like the program's impacts actually are today. So that's just generally something that I would try and stay away from, but I don't know if there's anything like the worst that you could do. I probably have to think about it more and then get back to you. All right, any other questions? All right, so seeing none, I think we can, oh, sorry, Kia.
I'd be really curious to see how you are able to educate those legislatures to think differently about people that receive SNAP. I would love to know what that looks like. It's something that I struggle with daily, you know, as there's something that just drives me nuts, you know, so I would love to see like what that looks like, what that approach looks like. How do you educate somebody without shaming them, especially if they're being stupid? I mean, this would be very useful for me in many, many ways.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, so
yeah,
one of my general principles is to like assume good faith until proven otherwise. And like, if we're talking about a proven otherwise situation, that's very different. But the way that we did it, and this is still an ongoing process because, you know, new folks come into the legislature every 2 years, was we had multiple lobby days, multiple hearings, multiple meetings with legislators to actually like bring folks who receive SNAP and use HIP to their offices to be like, hey, I'm a constituent, like this is what the program is actually like for me, and I'm not like what you think of, and like here's what the program actually does today, and like here's how it supports us, and here is how it could be better. And like that's, I'm obviously like very much compressing the process, but like having those repeatedly like helped to change folks. It wasn't like an overnight thing. And I honestly think that like some of it has come back a little bit with like the pandemic and us being a little bit more disconnected from one another, which is frustrating to see. But I think it's just another opportunity for us to connect with folks and be like, hey, like here's some real life people that are impacted by these programs that like maybe you should think of when you're talking about SNAP and HIP, for example. And so that's something on my to-do list. But I think just like making sure that folks with lived experience are actually like, you know, telling their stories and making it very clear like what the impact of programs are is one of the ways to do that. I think it also just like it really depends on the person that we're talking about, like in terms of decision makers. And it sometimes is like a thing that we need to do repeatedly, which I'm sure you understand. So,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, that was helpful. Thank you.
cool. Okay. Any other questions before we get into writing? Okay. So I think we can take, let's say, until 10:45 for this first question. Actually, let's say like 5 minutes. I know it's not a lot of time, I apologize, but let's say like 5 to 7 minutes to start writing, just whatever comes to mind when you see this prompt. Tell a story about a challenge you've had when interacting with the food system. Doesn't have to be perfect. We're going to spend the second session on May 10th really refining these, but I think just anything that comes to mind, just like get it out on paper, get it on your, like a nice blank Word document on your computer. And I will just mute myself. But does that make sense to everyone? Cool. I'm gonna say one more minute. I know the time is short, but we have also the following session to talk through these. All right, it is 10:44, so I'm gonna ask that we move on to our second prompt, and I will remind folks that again, I'll share these slides after. So don't feel like you need to have everything down on paper right now. But our second prompt is tell a story about a success you've had when interacting with the food system. And I'm gonna give us until 10:49 to write for this one. One more minute. All right, it is 10:49, so I'm gonna ask folks to come to a stop when it feels natural for you. And again, we will go over these in a lot more depth on May 10th. I know that was definitely not enough time to completely refine a story, but just to like get some notes down or some bullet points down, that should hopefully be a great start to developing that story. So thank you again for taking the time to do this with me. I really appreciate it. So we've had a couple of minutes to write down some stories and hopefully get the brain juices flowing about how the food system affects us. But I did just want to go over a couple bills as some folks asked about bills that are currently in play this session. I will say there are like between 5,000 and 7,000 bills filed each session on any given topic relating to state government. So this is not necessarily a comprehensive list of all of the bills that affect the food system. These are ones that we've at the collaborative pulled out that we're leading or that other folks that we work with are leading and we think should pass. So I work at the Mass Food System Collaborative. I lead a couple of these. We definitely have more bills than are listed here that we support that have been filed in the legislature, but these are the ones that really have campaigns behind them. So the Campaign for Healthy Incentives Program funding, the Agricultural Equity Network, food waste, which will provide a tax incentive for farmers to donate food, food system literacy, and PFAS, which is a new one for us. We've pulled together a coalition behind that is pretty diverse. It's like farmers, some environmental groups, some food waste groups that wrote a bill to kind of clarify like how we think PFAS should be dealt with when it's in regards to the food system. There's a larger PFAS bill in general. And sorry, if you don't know, like PFAS are a class of chemicals that are found in a lot of common household products. They relate to the food system because there are some municipalities that provide like municipal sludge that can be used as compost for fields that are then, like cattle are grazed on, orchards are planted, field crops are grown, and that affects like how the crops are grown. So again, I think this one will probably be familiar with folks, but the Campaign for HIP funding, we advocate to make sure that HIP is funded enough so it can operate year-round without interruption and support new SNAP households and new farmers. This year, we're advocating for $24 million, which is level funding, basically the same amount that it got last year for HIP. We're really thinking that this should be at least the amount of money the program should get because there are 107 new farmers added to the program, and there are also, inflation, the end of federal and state emergency allotment SNAP will mean HIP is going to be used a lot more this growing season. This is a photo from 2019, so it is a little bit dated, but we're hoping to update it this year. We are having an in-person lobby day at the State House this year. We haven't been able to since 2019, so I just like showing this because I miss doing things in person with the coalition. I'm really excited for that. And then this bill would codify the program into law because it currently only exists in regulations. This is our new campaign, so the Campaign for Food Literacy. My colleague Brittany Peets is leading this. It's to ensure that all students in grades K through 12 have access to food system education so they can learn about agriculture, nutrition, food justice, and culinary skills. So I really like these photos. They're really exciting. And Brittany has pulled together a coalition of teachers, nonprofit educators, school administrators, parents, students, and community members who are advocating for $1.25 million in the budget and a bill to enact this into law. So we had some students with us at Agriculture Day at the State House, and that was really exciting. So if you want to see those are on our Facebook. Sorry, this is blurry. It's less blurry when it's on a smaller size. So the Agricultural Equity Network is led by my colleague Norris Guscott, who's really awesome, and it's made up of and led by Mass farmers and food system stakeholders who identify as Black, Indigenous, or people of color. And so they wrote a bill, Senate Bill 41 and House Bill 87, that would create a commission made up of BIPOC farmers and leaders to look at, policy recommendations that support racially equitable investments and practices, resource and program accessibility of current programs that the state runs around farming, and recommendations related to equity in existing laws and regulations. And Norris has been writing and filing feedback when regulations are published relating to environmental justice. So that's been really cool. And of course, the collaborative is not the only food system organization out there. There are a lot of state level food system campaigns. These are some of them. I don't think this is necessarily comprehensive, but I do think these are some of the big ones at least. So some of the state level food system campaigns in play this year and this session. Universal School Meals is a big one. It's led by Project Bread. Most of these campaigns will have both a bill and a budget ask. So they have gotten some funding in both a supplemental budget and this year's state annual budget to fund this permanently, which is very exciting. As the budget is not done yet, that's not totally guaranteed. So they're going to keep advocating for that, but it's on a good path. Feeding Our Neighbors is led by Mass Law Reform Institute and La Colaborativa, which is based in Chelsea. Its goal is to establish a state-run and funded SNAP benefit for legally present immigrants. Massachusetts actually had this, I believe it was from 1997 to 2002, but I'll look it up, before the Clinton era welfare reforms, or excuse me, right after the Clinton era welfare reforms, like shoved a bunch of people off of SNAP, unfortunately. So they're trying to reestablish that program. They are advocating for a budget ask, and they also have a bill. Hunger Free College Campus is led by the Greater Boston Food Bank in coalition with the Food Bank of Western Mass and some public and private colleges. It would establish like a grant program to help colleges ensure that their students can access SNAP and colleges can set up food pantries on campus. Mass Farm to School advocates for farm to school grants, as you might imagine from their name. Those would help fund schools purchasing local food and dealing with the administrative costs. The Mass Food Trust program, they advocate for money in the budget, the state's annual operating budget for the administration of that program, and the actual funding for creating new food stores, locally owned grocery stores. That comes from the capital budget, which is separate, which I can talk about any other time than today, but they make sure that that continues and keeps funding new food retail in areas with low access. Lift Our Kids is led by the Greater Boston Legal Services. It's to increase the cash benefits. So TAFDC, temporary assistance to family with dependent children. So basically like the amount that benefit is at right now is extremely low. It does not keep up with inflation. It does not keep up with the cost of living. And their goal is to increase that until it does. And they've been advocating for that for a couple sessions now. Pesticides, NOFA Mass, so the Northeast Organic Farming Association, advocates for restrictions around pesticides and a lot of other things. MEFAP is the Massachusetts Emergency Food Assistance Program, which funds the food banks in purchasing mass-grown products. They have been funded at $30 million in previous budgets, and they're asking for, Emily, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it was 41. If Emily's still here, sorry.
She left. I think she wasn't feeling well.
All right, so I believe it was $41 million. I can check my spreadsheet and Emily can correct me if I'm wrong. And there are definitely more out there, but I would say those are the big ones around food security, food assistance, and farming right now. So we only have like 2 minutes, so this is gonna be a little difficult to have a real conversation about, but we can do it in our next session. So I did just want to like make sure that, hearing about those bills was helpful. Did that, help connect any issue to a personal story that you might share at a later point? Is there an issue that resonates? What do folks think? Pat?
I actually had a really hard time writing, and I think if I had seen some of these bills, it might have helped me, because I was trying to figure out, I did not grow up, I grew up poor, but I didn't have food insecurity, or at least I didn't think I did. Some of it I didn't realize I had until I was an adult. So my experience is sort of coming from the outside, and what I learned by stepping in to be with people who do face food insecurity through different things I've done. So, it would have, I don't know. I had a really hard time, and it might have helped to see them first.
Got it. I appreciate that. Yeah, it was tricky. We were trying to figure out like ways to make sure that folks didn't just like immediately see the bills and then only have ideas around those, but trying to be expansive as well. So again, I will share the slides. So if it's helpful to see those before our next session, those will be available to you. All right, and it is 11. So I did just want to. Okay, so that's the end of my presentation. So I just want to say thank you so much for your time. And I would definitely love to hear, more responses to this question. But again, I will share the slides, and I think if it's helpful, feel free to continue writing in between now and then, but like, obviously don't feel any pressure to. I'll also share some stories that we've done with folks for HIP with Caitlin and Kristen, if that's helpful, and they can share them out. My calendar is on May 10th from 12:30 to 2 p.m. So, okay. So then we'll meet up then to actually like dive deeper into story writing and sharing. So I hope this was helpful to like at least like get the process started. I know that there's a lot to think about, but I think sharing some of those examples and seeing the bills will be a little bit more helpful to like maybe narrow it down than just like talk about your entire life experience. So thanks again for inviting me, Caitlin.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I also just wanted to quickly say that the Food Policy Circle does plan to do the work of sort of identifying what bills are sort of linked to people's stories. So don't feel like you have to know exactly what the advocacy link is for your story. But yeah, thanks. I hope to see everyone on the 10th. Thank you, Becca.
Thanks, everybody.
See ya.